You're listening to Rhett Read Podcast. I'm Anna.
I'm Serge, and we're here to talk about books we've read.
Hope you enjoy. Hey, Serge.
Hey, Anna. Welcome to a special episode of Rhett Read Podcast.
We were able to do an interview with author Isaac Sobin, whose book The Last Machine in the Solar System was published earlier this month. To all you Fear Street fans, don't worry. Our review of Fear Street Ski Weekend will be released shortly.
The interview does contain spoilers for Matt's book, so pick up a copy of the book and give it a read first.
We hope you enjoy our inaugural interview. In his debut novelette, The Last Machine in the Solar System, Isaac Sobin writes a story about an android named Jonathan, the last machine, who is built to outlive the death of humanity, Earth, Mars, and our solar system in general. It is also the story of the human race's greatest successes and ultimate failure. He joins us today via Skype to talk about his book, writing, and himself. Welcome to the show, Matt.
Thanks so much, Anna. It's great to be on with you and Serge. I'm a big fan of the show.
Great, thank you. Just to start off with, we'd like to talk about you and your writing. And just to get things started, the general question that I'm sure you get from everybody, how did you get into writing and when did it happen for you?
Well, I think I was a bit of a slow developer. I'm not that old yet, but a lot of people start pretty young and they always say that, they've always been writing stories, and I wasn't sure what I was really doing with my life. And I read a lot, but I really only started experimenting with writing, I'd say in like my mid-20s. And I wrote one novel, which, was like my trial run, my test run. I did a lot of experimenting in that. That's one that's not meant to, really leave the writer's desk. And then I started writing more poetry, which I enjoyed. It was more, instant fulfillment. I could sit down and spend 15, 20 minutes or an hour and, have something that I was proud of, that I thought people would like to hear. So I wrote a lot of poetry, and I got into short stories because short stories was, sort of similar in that way. And then my writing definitely took a turn when I moved to San Francisco. So my relocation to San Francisco is kind of like the big incident that kickstarted my writing, because I met some amazing people that had a big influence on me. During the next 2 years when I was in San Francisco, I wrote my first novel, which isn't yet published, though I am working on that right now. So that one I do intend to publish. And I spent 2 years writing that. It's actually totally different than The Last Machine. It's literary fiction, so I don't think of it as science fiction. And at that point, I was looking for an agent, so I started thumbing through my alumni directory for my school that I went to. I went to Tufts University in Boston, and I came across this agent in the Bay Area. Even though he didn't offer me representation, he offered me a part-time job, so it was sort of like this weird, circumstances that led me to him, and then from him to the illustrator of The Last Machine, who's an amazing individual named Katz, who's done just tremendous illustrations for this book. For those that aren't familiar with Jack is somewhat of a living legend. He has sort of a cult following for his work. He created what is arguably, I put in the arguably, even though I'm of the opinion it is, the first graphic novel between 1974 and 1986 called The First Kingdom. It's an unbelievable epic that spans 10,000 years and about 1,000 pages, taking mankind from the destruction of atomic holocaust to the exploration of outer space. So to me, he's an unbelievable creative. He's 89 years old now, and getting to know him really changed my writing. He really encouraged me, sort of told me that, I had to write, I had to do these things, that I had the capabilities to do it. And then obviously the fact that he wanted to illustrate my work was a big vote of confidence. He doesn't really illustrate too many people's work, and it wasn't something that I asked him to do. He just wanted to do it. So that really was sort of the genesis of the Last Machine. I guess that's about it as far as, how my writing into science fiction got started.
That's actually really interesting that you brought up Jack Katz, because we wanted to talk about him a little bit as well, and it's really cool to hear that he's actually a major influence on your writing.
Yeah.
Actually, Anna went ahead and read some of your poems coming into this. We noticed that you also have some Jack Katz illustrations to go with your poems as well.
Oh, absolutely. Before The Last Machine was illustrated, we had the poems. I originally thought it was, I'd be releasing a poetry collaboration with Jack, and, we'd have all those illustrations. I think there's about 30 at least illustrated poems that we have. Some of them are just, unbelievable, his artwork. And there is a page up on Inkshares, which is the publisher's site, with a draft for that work. I haven't tried to fund it. I think it would be a big challenge. Not that it isn't publishable, but it's just that, it was hard enough to, do a crowdfunding campaign to publish The Last Machine, which is, science fiction that people are super into. Poetry is a steeper hill to climb. But yeah, I had started to write poetry, and I would just bring him poems to read. And I would leave them with him, and then they would get illustrated, and it was just tremendous. It was tremendous. I know, it was sort of surreal. And then we would go to like the computer store together, the computer lab, and we would print out poems on like larger paper, like what would it be, like 11 by 14 usually. And I'd put like the poem on the side, so he would have a lot of white space to work with, and then he would create around the poem. And that's kind of how it started. Then I eventually did The Last Machine, which is, I call it a novelette. Some people will call it a novella. It's on the shorter side for a novella. It's like 65 pages. He kind of became almost obsessed with the creator character, more so than the robot. I always loved it when he did the illustrations for the robot, and there are some awesome ones. But he was really into the Nikolai character. He was always asking me, what are his interests? Did he have siblings? Was he interested in politics? Like all this stuff. And it kind of made me think about the character in a lot more depth. I still sometimes I go and visit him, and he'll just have a new illustration for me of the creator. And I think it's awesome. And I put it in like a laminated portfolio and just keep it if maybe I'll use it someday.
That's really cool. I know that you plan on doing more work within the universe of The Last Machine. You're planning on doing more biographies on Nikolai and Jonathan. Do you plan on putting the artwork in those works?
Ideally, yeah, that's exactly what I'd like to do. Jack, more than anything, wants me to do the biography of Nikolai, the creator, written by Jonathan, the robot. So the novella that, we're talking about, The Last Machine, it's really Jonathan's story written by Jonathan. There's some flashback where he goes into the creator and we learn about the creator, but considering the fact that he spends, multiple billions of years in outer space, and we know he's very focused on his creator, there's no doubt that he would have written an extensive biography about the man. I hope I can make that reality, and that's why I'm always happy when I get a new illustration from Jack, because most of them will hopefully find their way into that book.
It's really cool how his illustration process helps you with your character building as well. You don't really hear that a lot coming from authors. I feel like there's more of a disconnect when you talk to other authors in terms of their works, where there's not as much of a collaborative process.
Yeah, it's really true. I mean, in the beginning, it was more me, but then as I started to finish the book and he started to create illustrations, it did help my character development. And then in subsequent drafts of The Last Machine, it made a difference. Like the whole section in the middle of the book where I'm going into Nikolai in more depth, and we're talking about, what happened to him when he tried to compose music, and eventually, he comes up with this great discovery. That was new. The majority of that was not in the first draft. And a lot of that came about because of my discussions with Jack and, talking about the character and him asking for more material, basically saying, I want to create this guy. I want to really illustrate him. So, what is the things that motivated him? Why did he create this robot? What was the heartbreak that he experienced that made him do something that took such, foresight and was on such a crazy scale? And then, that middle section of the book, I think, adds a lot of depth.
Actually, I just want to jump ahead here a little bit. A question I personally had, and as long as we're talking about the creator, as someone of Ukrainian ancestry, it kind of tickled me that Nikolai was supposed to be Ukrainian. I was wondering where that came from, or if it was just random.
It was mostly random. Ukraine has been in the headlines a significant amount in the last couple of years. It was almost, I don't know, I saw him as being Eastern European. I'm of Eastern European descent. I don't know if that has something to do with it. You know, he's kind of a composite between Einstein and Tesla with artificial intelligence thrown in. There's almost a subtle jab in there towards, very subtle, to the political situation that's been going on in Ukraine. Just saying that obviously it's so far in the future, but he mentions that the country of Ukraine no longer exists. So there is that line in the book.
Which may be what tickled me a little bit.
Did current events influence anything? It must have been written during the whole election period.
Yeah, right. I wrote it. I started it actually because I write everything longhand actually, and I always date the pages, so I know I started October 1st, 2015, and it took about a month, at least for the first draft. You know, I would say that the politics didn't play a big role in it. I really didn't start out looking to make a statement. That was not the goal. I had watched a show on the Science Channel. I was into the idea of the life cycle of the solar system. I thought it was cool. I wanted to create big images. You know, some people have said it was, poetic. Maybe that's just the way I write, but I wanted people to really be able to visualize the imagery of what was happening in outer space. And that was my initial motivation. And then it sort of built from there. There are some references to immigration and refugee situations that come towards the end of humanity's story in the book. And there are definite tendencies that parallel kind of these isolationist tendencies today. So, they're there. And I think in some ways, it's timely. It shows that immigration is always going to be front and center because we're so globally connected. And in this book, immigration is still an issue because we're so interplanetarily connected. So it was a question of, immigration from the Earth to Mars during the, waning years of the Earth. It's like, who could escape? Who could go to that other place? So, those are interesting parallels today. They weren't planned, but they sort of came in nicely, I think.
You said that the book took you a month to write. Did you set, writing goals for yourself? Like, I need to write 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, that sort of thing? Or is it just you wrote when you felt like writing?
I wrote when I felt like writing, but I was really motivated to do this one. It was different than anything else I had written. So when I wrote the longer novels, at times it was a real slog. Those can be really challenging. You're kind of thinking, okay, where is the plot going? How do I get myself out of this mess that I just painted my character into? I always knew in The Last Machine where the story was going. I knew the end. That was never in question. To some reading the story, maybe they can even see where it was going. There's a sense of inevitability in the story, which is fine, I think. The sensation that I had when writing this, which was very different than my other writing, was I was almost like just writing it down. Like, it was almost being dictated to me. So I could just sit there for long stretches of this book, and I just had to get it down on paper because I already knew the story. That wasn't from the very beginning, but pretty shortly after I had started the first few pages, I had it in my mind, at least what the first draft was going to be, and I was just writing it down. And then also, I took it to Jack and I said, hey, this isn't quite done, but why don't you take a look at this? He said, this is better than anything you've done before, so you should definitely keep working on it and, finish it. So that's what I did. I can only hope that other works that I write will have that same sort of feeling of, I know exactly where this is going. This is easy. Because writing is not easy, but writing this book, at least the first draft, was pretty easy. And I think that is, a rare occurrence. So I think I got pretty fortunate with that.
Do you think that poetry comes more easily to you than prose? As a follow-up question to that, you mentioned that you had a tougher time writing your long-form novels versus this short novelette. And we actually noticed that I think it was another interview you did, somebody compared this novelette to poetry and said it was actually quite poetic. And I'm wondering if maybe there's a correlation there.
I enjoyed that interview. I thought that was a great question by Elon in that interview. And yeah, I have done a lot of poetry. I like submitting my poetry to contests or, actually the last couple of years I've read my poetry at the local county fair, which is, there's not usually a big crowd, but I still get butterflies. It's still sort of a scary thing to do whenever you're getting up in front of people and, reading your work. I think poetry can come easier. I think I write a lot of, maybe this is true of everybody. I don't know if a lot of poets would admit this, but I'm not afraid to say I write a lot of bad poetry. And then I also, occasionally write a poem that I'm proud of. I go out and I write my best poetry outside. I don't think that's that unusual. Something about nature being outside helps with poetry. So I think it does maybe come a little bit easier. And with The Last Machine, I don't know. Like I said in that other interview, it's kind of cool to think of Jonathan as a poet, if people want to think of that. I mean, he's the most read, literate android. That's sort of his conception. He was able to write this in his own voice. For the most part, it's pretty eloquent, I think. That wasn't really the intent, but he had his own voice, and that's the voice that I used.
Was it difficult finding Jonathan's voice? Like, were you ever tempted to make him sound like Data from The Next Generation?
No, I didn't want him to be that. Really, the only thing about Jonathan, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, that is not human is his lifespan. That was necessary because of his ultimate task, and that's why Nikolai created him as he did, made of the substances that would last for that period of time. But other than that, the factors that influenced him, the way humanity behaved, Nikolai's reaction to them, extreme isolation for long periods of time, those were sort of these factors that existed that made him who he is. And I just tried to have him, react and behave in response to those factors, as I thought I would. And I don't know, it's very, this is getting into the realm of, the impossible, 2 billion years. How would anyone react? There could have been a totally different outcome. He could have become, super depressed and, decided, hey, time to power down or something like that. Really hard to say, but I didn't want to make him particularly robotic. The title is The Last Machine. It could easily be The Last Human or The Last Consciousness, The Last Being, or anything like that.
You said that you got the idea after watching a show on the Science Channel. Did you do any other research while writing the book?
I did a little bit of research on the planets. I wanted it to be scientifically accurate. It's mostly accurate. You guys found one big inaccuracy. Though we could talk about that more. I think we came to terms on what the actual inaccuracy is. But yeah, I did want the science to be accurate, and the reason for that was I wanted it to be believable. I wanted it to be almost hard science fiction philosophy. Almost like that, not fantasy. In theory, in a world that is 300 or 400 years more technologically advanced, maybe everything in here is plausible. The way the solar system behaves is pretty accurate. I mean, from the research I've done. So, I wanted to demonstrate that, show people that most people probably aren't thinking about, how the sun is eventually going to die. But that is something that, in my mind, is something that we should be aware of. All of this is going to end, and the question is, are we going to end with it, or will we end before that? I mean, in some ways, you could look at the story as being really optimistic in the fact that we made it that far. I mean, right now it's a little tenuous. Who knows how long humans will be around? It's interesting. I mean, I did do research. I tried to get, when I talked to the publisher, I even said to the publisher, can we get a scientist to read this? Like, I would really like this to be as accurate as possible. They weren't able to make that happen. I had some other people read it. I do actually know, one scientist who I had read it, and he gave me some feedback that helped me expand my description of the planet Jupiter in there. So that was helpful. Some people have said it's too sciencey. Some people say it has the science that they're looking for. And I wanted it to, be a balance, because it's about humanity, but it's also about the solar system. And the way I think about it is, it was Nikolai versus humanity. That was conflict number one. And then it was humanity versus the sun, and ultimately Jonathan versus the sun.
For what it's worth, I personally think you struck a very good balance there between the science and the philosophy. I really enjoyed the book, obviously, based on our review here on Ret Read. Just to go back a little bit to the timeline. So the one thing that wasn't in the book, but we found out through our discussion with you, is that Nikolai was born in 2339. Jonathan was created in 2391. And then the trip to Mars occurs in 2405. And let us know if you don't want this to be disclosed publicly. But is there any specific reason that those years were chosen? And is there any reason they weren't included in the actual text of the book?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And the reason was, one, I didn't think it was that important, but, to give context, maybe 1 year should have been put in there. The reason I know the actual years is because I had started writing the biography, and I didn't even really think about the specific years when I was writing The Last Machine. I started to think about it when I started working on the biography. I said, okay, now I need to really know exactly where he is, he being Nikolai, what's he doing, who's he with. I need to know the exact timeline. When I wrote The Last Machine, I knew, roughly speaking, he was 300 years or give or take 400 years in the future. And beyond that, it wasn't really that important to me when it was. But at the same time, I of course wanted it to be clear to folks that, he was there. And I can see there being a little bit of confusion. But, to your point about Continental Drift, that was never something I was even contemplating. The idea that he can see Philadelphia or he can see a drowned version of New York City was me trying to give some context to the time that it was.
Yeah, so from that point of view, it makes perfect sense. If I look at it just with that chapter standing alone by itself, I should have no doubt as to what the timeline is. But I was coming at it from the opposite, from the astrophysics standpoint, because of my background. So I got a little confused there.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. Like we said, if there is an inaccuracy, it's probably that the Facebook page that I created for The Last Machine, the handle is at 3 billion years with the number 3. And that's probably right there in a nutshell why it's slightly inaccurate, because it should probably be like at 5 billion years or something like that. I may have sped up the overall life cycle of the sun, which I was trying to tell, so I told it, but it might be, on fast forward slightly.
Yeah, you're not giving Nikolai enough credit.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. So he should have been, an even longer lived being, in order to accomplish his end results.
We just talked about a bunch of dates. We know that you studied history at Tufts. Did that help shape the future that you created here? I know when I think of history class, I just think about memorizing dates. So somehow this brought the question to my mind.
Well, I would say that, like we had just said, the book is largely philosophical, and there are a lot of things that are somewhat ambiguous, particularly the opening preliminary section. I'm not even sure anybody's really gotten it yet. Maybe you want to send me a direct message after this and let me know what you thought of the preliminary section. To me, ambiguity, especially in this kind of science fiction, is fine. So I didn't think too much about specific dates. I just wanted to create this long, sweeping timeline that would tell the overall story of mankind, humanity, the solar system, and then, of course, my two primary characters. I don't think that, my history background played too much of a role in it. That seems an awfully long time ago to me right now.
Okay. So I think one of the things I mentioned in my review is that I saw definitely a big similarity between this book and the writings of Isaac Asimov, who I really enjoyed growing up. One of the big ones is what you just mentioned, the long timeline, the giant arc of history. And the other one that really stuck out to me is the lack of a first contact scenario. We don't see any aliens coming in, despite the fact that many sci-fi universes imagine first contact as being something that happens naturally. Right. Maybe you could comment on that.
You're probably not surprised, but I've thought about aliens a lot. I guess my thought on aliens is, and hey, there are people out there that think that first contact is something that will happen. Eventually, it has to happen because we'll be here and eventually they'll find us, or we'll leave here and we'll get smart enough to find them. But let's assume, we can't leave and we never get to that point. Then the question is there anyone else out there? And if there is, can they get here? So because this timeline is so big, it's possible that the most advanced civilization has already come and gone, or will only begin and end after we're gone. So in my head, we're looking for so many factors to overlap. The universe is almost infinite as far as we know. Then they need to exist in our time and be in reasonably close proximity, or be so technologically advanced that they could get here. From that perspective, I was going on the side of, during humanity's existence, we're not going to have the Independence Day scenario. That might be unrealistic. But like I said, you might want to give that preliminary section another look.
Now, speaking of Independence Day, that actually brings up an interesting thought I had regarding this book. Oftentimes in science fiction, that first contact is what actually gives the impetus to drive humanity to travel beyond our solar system. Do you think the lack of a first contact would actually be one of the major reasons why humanity didn't expand? Or do you think there's just something intrinsic? The whole quote about the lack of a sort of hive mind.
Yeah, no, the hive mind part in the beginning is a big part of the book. So you're theorizing that if we had a first contact, it would almost propel us like war has propelled technology to somehow advance ourselves into leaving the solar system?
Right. That seems to be a pretty common theme amongst a lot of other sci-fi, especially the pop sci-fi you see on the television and movies nowadays.
It's a tough call. I don't know if we're going to get lucky enough to have a benevolent visitor. Independence Day might actually be somewhat realistic if they show up here unexpectedly. And then I'm not sure, if we would be able to sort of escape that encounter. So I don't know. I don't see that. I would have to think about it more, but I think either we get super lucky and they arrive and they're benevolent and they just want to save us, which nobody really wants to be saved. So that could be a problem also. Or they come and they're really violent and we don't survive because their technology is so far advanced. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think that spurs us on to greater heights. I think we need to do that on our own, which has a lot to do with that section in the beginning where Jonathan says, why don't we all behave like bumblebees, basically? That doesn't seem to be part of the larger human nature. In some smaller groups, sure, we work really well together, but on a global scale or on a human scale, I haven't really seen that. I mean, in my short life, but I haven't really seen that, reading history books either. Unless something changes, that may end up being fairly accurate and, that would be unfortunate. That's kind of what drove Nikolai. He made this great discovery that in theory could have been the salvation of mankind. Nobody listened to him.
I think both of us really like that part of the book. The creativity quotient is such a great idea.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just kind of popped into my head, and I was like, oh, I love that name for it. That's great. And I wrote it down. So, yeah, and like I said, that part of the book wasn't in there in the first go-around, but I think it took a story that was pretty good and hopefully took it to another level.
Oh, for sure. That definitely took it to another level for me. And also, another sort of Asimov-esque thing to it. It has a little bit of a ring of psychohistory to it from the Foundation series, but not saying that it's like the same thing. It's actually a very different theory. And a very unique thought. So I commend you for that. Thank you for bringing it to your readers.
Yeah, they are very welcome. And I've heard a couple of times this, allusion to or mention of Asimov, and it's just unbelievable for me because he's number one on my list of great sci-fi. And obviously I've devoured Foundation, and his work is unbelievable. And maybe one day I'll finish reading everything he's written, which is an accomplishment in itself. It's unbelievable how many books he's written.
Right, yeah.
I have a 1,000-page book by Asimov, which goes into Shakespeare. It's crazy how brilliant he was and how many different disciplines he wrote in. He's almost kind of like a a Nikolai character. He's unbelievable how he wrote on all these different topics. So yeah, the comparison is very humbling to me. Yeah, I do see that the psychohistory, and obviously the Foundation has that huge scope of time and the timeline, and Harry Seldon was able to kind of help humanity by being able to predict how things would go. Creativity Quotient's a little bit different, and in the book it's a little vague how it would work. I might be able to write more about that in the biography. Hopefully is something that readers will find interesting.
I do want to maybe fall back to the creativity quotient a little bit more, and also at the same time talk about, once again, just the idea of expanding beyond the solar system, because this is a pretty rare view in sci-fi where humans get stuck here in the solar system, and I just want to approach it from a different angle here. The creativity quotient is something that allows Nikolai to tap into his full creative potential, which he wasn't able to do before he discovered that theory. He was trying to do that in a way to prove his theory, but it also showed that anybody could apply it in order to unlock humanity's full potential. At least that's how I understood it. The thing is, to my mind, if you look back at human history, at many times there have been people who have been able to tap into a great creativity or a great motivating force of some sort without knowing this theorem. It just kind of came naturally to them. And some of them, when applied in a political field, for example, if you look at the pharaohs of Egypt, right? They were actually able to organize their people, well, at least during one period of time, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, into almost a hive society and create the pyramids, which is a task that, given their technological level as we know it, was very, very difficult, and nobody would have thought they'd been able to do it. And so I'm wondering, is it possible just by random chance that such a figure could arise again and basically, through sheer force of will, force humanity out of the solar system? You could think of Dune, for instance, where if you read some of the later books, the God Emperor actually purposefully triggers a diaspora that spreads humanity across the galaxy.
I haven't read that. That sounds interesting. I might have to look into that. I guess what I would say is, one, I find the ancient Egypt reference interesting. They were very motivated in one direction, all moving together. I wouldn't call it a hive, though, because it was a hive with a whip. So that, to me, means obviously they were slaves involved. If you have control over everybody, then you can do amazing things, but, that's no way for a modern society to work. So yeah, my thinking about the creativity quotient was, obviously there are natural creatives. Somebody can be a great musician, can create great music, can create, a work of art. A great artist who creates an oil on canvas doesn't need to use a mathematical equation in order to do that. But now if that artist wanted to do something else, then they would potentially use the creativity quotient for that. So what the creativity quotient allowed Nikolai to do was really branch out, not limit his creativity to a single discipline. I actually go into this quite a bit in the biography because and this is again why Asimov is so amazing to me, because he's, writing in so many different disciplines. The ability to be multi-disciplined in your creativity is very difficult and very rare. So I think that's what the creativity quotient would allow. It's interesting to hear you hypothetically talk about it being leveraged in a political way. Can you be a creative political? I suppose you could. It could be very dangerous. And, at the part of the book where Jonathan is talking about the creativity quotient, he says Nikolai was ignored. The creativity quotient wasn't adopted or recognized, and now it lives inside of him. And it might have brought salvation, when combined with theory of general relativity, the theory of the universe. But could it have just expedited the downfall of humanity? Maybe they wouldn't have lived as long at all because of something like you're talking about. Or it could spur them to greatness and they might have left the solar system. So that's like a Harry Seldon question right there.
That's right.
How would that have developed? Because you could see it going in either direction, and they're totally different directions.
Just out of curiosity, so Jonathan, at the end of the book, he has all of human writing at his disposal. He knows he's dying, and the knowledge of humanity will die with him. He chooses to leave the Bible behind as humanity's last testament. Was there a lot of thought behind what he would leave behind, and what made you finally decide on him leaving the Bible?
He's leaving the Bible, but, towards the end of the book, he does mention that he's come to terms really with what he's doing, he recognizes what he's really leaving behind is himself. Without giving everything away, he is the monument to humanity. He is the information that mankind accrued through written works and scientific discoveries and observations, and it's all inside him. In theory, if anybody discovered him, what a find it would be, what a treasure trove. That the Bible is there, I don't think much more than Nikolai's sort of last little dig at humanity for not recognizing him. In a sense, I think he feels that human society didn't work. It was founded on religious principles. That sort of underpinning to the fabric of humanity made it so that this was the end result. And he's just sort of leaving it there to say, let it reverberate across space and time and say, this didn't work. But that's not really his gift. That's almost like, to me, it was like a dig. I don't know if that clarifies things, because the book is very secular, and I think people who read it recognize that there's not a lot of religion. And always like, oh, he's leaving the Bible? What's he doing that for? It's also not really I'm not trying to be anti-religion either, but that was sort of his way of saying thanks a lot.
That actually makes a lot of sense. If it was you standing on the surface of the dead sun, what book would you have left?
Do I get to leave them all? I mean, you'd leave the library. I mean, that's what we're trying to do is, obviously mostly, it's almost entirely an electronic library, but, I don't know. It would be kind of ironic. You could leave Foundation. That would be funny. Yeah, I don't know. Hard to pick one book. If you're leaving it in a serious way, then that book would have to be really profound. I don't know what that book is right now.
Since we're talking about books, you got published through Inkshares. We just want to kind of feel out what your opinion is and how is it compared to mainstream publishing, quote unquote.
So Inkshares is quite different. It's somewhat of I don't know if it's unique. There are a few other publishers that do similar things. I know there's at least one in the UK that is almost identical. It's a hybrid form of publishing where you are raising capital to cover the production costs before the book exists. So I entered a contest. You don't have to enter a contest. If you fund 750 pre-orders, you can have a book. It's really kind of that simple, but that is a lot more easily said than done. Hard to convince any number of people, let alone 750, to put down money for something that doesn't exist yet and may not for 1 or 2 years. In my case, it's ended up being like a year and 4 months from the end of the contest to the publication. But like I said, they also do contests. That's what I did. It was a way to sort of shortcut what I needed to do. So instead of having to convince 750 people to pre-order the book, I only had to finish top 3 in the contest, and I finished in second in the Sword and Laser. And I ended up, I think, with 350 people. So 350 people in that contest was good for second place and was good enough to make a book. That worked out great for me. It was incredibly stressful. It was a 6-week contest, so 6 weeks, and I sold 350 pre-orders. It required every person in my immediate network to, be on board. Obviously, my family, my close friends. I think I sent a personal message to, if I had your contact information, to everyone I knew that I had even spoken to in a cursory way in the last decade. Like, just running like at 1,000,000 miles an hour, hey, what do you think about this? I could really use $10. Also unique readers in a contest. So the contest is a little more challenging that way. Like my mom can't go on there and buy 1,000 books. That doesn't help. She's just one person. She counts as one. So you really need individual people. That worked for me. I would recommend that to people if they are interested in Inkshares because 1, you don't have to do 750. 2, even if you don't finish top 3, you may be significantly down the road towards reaching a funding goal. Maybe you did 200 orders or something. Well, that's, now a lot less than you would have had to have done before. And a contest kind of creates this real urgency to buy the book. Less stress to do it over a longer period of time, which you can do if you just want to get your 750, but somebody will say, oh, well, I have 3 months to do this. I'll do it later. In the contest, that wasn't really there. They had to do it. They had to do it then, and that's why it worked for me. Compared to regular traditional publishing, Like I mentioned at the beginning, I met Jack Katz through a literary agent named Peter Barron. So I've been, on the fringe of traditional publishing. I've worked a little bit with Peter part-time. I even vetted some manuscripts that had come into him. It's interesting. I think eventually I would still like to go the traditional route if possible. I think it would be a lot less stressful, which is really, I think, the big one for me on why I might prefer it. But as a first-time author, this was a great opportunity, and I'm glad I did it, and I obviously worked out really, really well, and I couldn't be happier with how the book came out. It really looks beautiful. So Inkshares did a great job. They teamed with Girl Friday. Girl Friday, I believe, is in Seattle, so they did all the design, the interior design, and all that stuff. They picked the cover artist, Dan Stiles, and he did an unbelievable job. I don't know if you noticed, the silhouetted figures on the cover of the book are the same figures on the image that follows the end of the story. So if you turn the page after the last page of the story and you look at that image, he took these figures that Jack drew and he incorporated them in his own design in a unique way. To me, that's the sign of a great artist. That's, to me, unbelievable. Take someone else's art and make it your own. So really, I worked with a lot of talented people in the production of the book, and I'm just thrilled with how it came out.
Yeah, we also enjoyed the cover art. As shallow as that sounds, that's one of the important parts of a good sci-fi novel. Oh man, that sounds really dumb, but seriously though, when you're in Barnes & Noble and you're browsing through the books,
yeah, you're absolutely right. It's got to be eye-catching. I saw about 3 different options. I really liked them all. There was one where there was Jonathan's head was the cover, and he was blue. I'm not sure why he was blue. I didn't really picture him as being blue. But then the sun, his cranium was kind of transparent, and the sun was inside his head, as his brain. It was kind of cool. I was tempted to go with it, but I think I made the right choice.
I think so too.
Does having your book published, having your first book out, change the way you write now, how you approach it? Are you more tempted to stick with sci-fi because, as you said previously, it's more likely to get funded?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would, the funny answer to that question is, how has having my book out changed how I write? It's changed how I write by making me not write, which is terrible. I need to write. I'm happiest when I write. But I feel like I've got a million things going on, and, I'm trying to prepare for a book signing or do a podcast. Thank you guys very much, by the way. So when I do get back to writing, how will it change it? I think, obviously this book was successful and people have, really taken to it, which has been amazing. So I think I will stay with science fiction, at least for the next one. The previous one, like I said, which I still want to publish and I'm working on very hard right now, just went through a second round of edits, is not science fiction. I still want to get that out. So it may look like my next book is not science fiction, but it was written before this one. Just the chronology of them coming out is going to be a little different. But then I'll get back to sci-fi.
One last sort of writing question. Do you have a writing kryptonite? Something that just the kind of writing or type of writing or this kind of scene that you just can't get through?
Yeah, it can be really challenging. Like I said earlier, it wasn't for this book. Maybe that's because for the most part, I only had one character. But in, writing more involved novels that have more characters, a more elaborate cast, that can be very challenging, and I've certainly experienced my fair share of writer's block. I don't know if that's a real thing, but you can certainly get stuck. You just kind of have to remember that you need to write, and I don't do a lot of outlining. For me, writing is more fun when it's organic and I'm just writing, which is why The Last Machine was so cool, and I didn't need to outline anything. I just knew where it was going, and that was great. But even for the novel, maybe it makes it a little more difficult for me, not outlining. But if I have an outline next to me, then it's almost like I've ruined the element of creativity that's going into it. So if you are stuck, but you're an outline type of writer, the outline may help you there. If you're stuck and like me and you're not someone that uses an outline, then that can be really tricky. And something that I've tried to do in the past is write something else or just skip ahead and write a different scene, something that you feel more confident in. You could always come back to it. You don't have to write the book necessarily in order. I like to write it in order, but also for my other novel, there were a significant number of flashbacks. So even I could skip ahead and say, okay, I know I can go ahead. I know this flashback is coming. I know exactly what's going into it. I can do that. And then maybe I'll have the clarity to go back and figure out this area where I'm stuck. And that has worked for me sometimes.
We're just gonna get towards the end of the interview here, and we're kind of a book review podcast, and we're currently going through a series of books that people generally read in their childhood. So with that in mind, we're gonna ask you 4 questions, and then basically we'll just ask you all the questions right now, and then you can try to answer them as best you can. If you forget to answer one of them, that's fine. So to start off with, what is your favorite book from your childhood? Favorite book you read recently, favorite book of all time, and what are you currently reading?
Favorite book from my childhood, I think I'm going to say, was The Thief of Always by Clive Barker. Are you familiar with that one?
I am not.
No.
Oh, really? Okay. Yes, I mean, most people think of Clive Barker as being, like a horror writer, but I think that's a bad rap. I think when Stephen King is thought of as a horror writer, that's a bad rap. These are very talented people that can, write anything. And so this book was kind of scary. It was a fantasy book, but it was for kids. I think my 7th grade English teacher had us read it. I wasn't that big into reading then. I was even a late bloomer with reading. I mean, I got much more into reading after he had us read that book in 7th grade. And to me, that book was, this kid, he's not happy, then he gets somehow caught in this house, this haunted, enchanted house. And the house is like secretly evil, and it was a very cool book, and that was very exciting. I remember at the time, and then I was like, told my uncle about it. I'm like, Uncle, you have to. My uncle, you have to read this book. That's for 7th grade. Yeah. So I would say that was my favorite childhood book. Favorite book of all time. Ooh, that's really tough. The funny thing is, and this is gonna. I could name another favorite from Clive Barker, and I never think of Clive Barker as being like my favorite author or anything, because I've only read a few books, but they're all like stellar. I love the Imagica books. Those are awesome. That's by Clive Barker. I love Taipan, which is in the Asian series by, why am I blanking? It's Clavel, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, Clavel, right?
Yeah, thanks.
I think, I knew it. Yeah, I read his translation of Sun Tzu's Art of War. But I know he did like some Japanese novels or something.
He's written a number of it throughout all history in the Asian, region. Like he did Shogun, which takes you through the samurai period in Japan. But the Taipan novel, which is later, which is like when they're opening up Hong Kong for trading, that is I think the only book I can think of where I remember the last line of the book. He like somehow crystallized that last line, and it's still in my head. I can tell it to you word for word. I can't think of another book that's done that. Like I know what happened on the last page of a lot of books, but I don't remember like word for word the last line of a lot of books. But I do that one. So that was one of my favorites. What am I reading right now? Well, I have next to me a book of essays by Albert Einstein. It's called Out of My Later Years, which I've just started getting into. And he wrote it kind of in a less scientific way. It's almost more accessible to the everyday person, which is nice. That's kind of me almost doing a little, Nikolai research. Like I said, I think of him as like a Tesla-Einstein hybrid. So doing some Einstein research. And I think that was 3. What was the 4th one?
Favorite book that you've read recently.
But actually, according to the rules, we have to move on, and Anna will ask the 5th and final question.
What are the rules?
The rules are we ignore a question that he forgets. I leave that out at the beginning.
Okay, I didn't know that was a rule. So we have a random question, which is, if you could write for any sci-fi show from the 90s to present day, which show would it be?
Wow, that's a good one. Man, Can I think about it for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely.
A lot of good shows came out that period.
What, like all?
Yeah. I mean, TNG came out in the 80s.
Right,
It was airing in the
that's true.
90s.
What was your favorite 90s sci-fi show?
Mine is Stargate SG-1.
Mine is X-Files.
This answer is more from, my point of view as a writer. I've never really thought about writing for TV shows, and I love the X-Files. And as a viewer, I could watch those same formulaic kind of episodes that, introduce this weird thing, and then it's kind of like a mystery, and then, there's a resolution, and they go to the next episode. But I don't know that I would really be interested in doing that. I would love to write movies. That would be super cool. I mean, I liked Arrival that was just out. That was fun. I liked that. But, it's more like writing a science fiction book, and then it has one arc and it's done. And then, I could do something else that would be interesting. That's sort of, I guess, my writing answer, and I didn't really answer your question.
Before we wrap it up, I just wanted to say that I did check out your poetry today, and I really related to your poem, Toils and Turbulations.
Oh, okay.
But
Great.
I really liked Jack Katz's illustration, Without Regard, the pirate and the dog. I thought that was really beautiful.
That is a perfect example of me never telling Jack what to illustrate or, how to illustrate a drawing. We do not plan. I don't go there with a poem and say, I wrote this poem. This is what I want you to draw for it. That never happens. I brought him Without Regard. I didn't expect to get a pirate illustration, but it works. So it's cool. And I said, and he's like, do you like it? It's a pirate. And I said, I love it. This is great. Yeah, that was a short one. I was sitting by the pool, and this lady was walking her dog by, and the dog had 3 legs, and then I just wrote the poem. And the Tribulations one that's a really personal one. A lot of those stanzas are personal to me. Some of them aren't. There's a stanza in there that sort of alludes to dyslexia. Jack happens to be dyslexic, which is sort of unbelievable that he could write 1,000-page illustrated graphic novels while being dyslexic. You can imagine how hard that is. I'm glad you liked that one. That one in particular is more personal than most.
Yeah, no, they were really, really great, and I do hope that your book of poetry can get published, because the ones, I think you had 3 other ones on another Inkshare page, and then you had 3 that had the illustrations out, and I thought they were all great, so.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Before we go, how can our listeners get themselves a copy of your book, and how can they find you online?
So the book is now available in paperback and ebook through Amazon. It's also available through Barnes & Noble and some other independent bookstores, but easiest way to get it is certainly Amazon. Ebook and paperback are available there. If they want to get in touch with me, they can find me on Twitter. It's @WriterMattIsaac. There's also a Facebook page specifically for The Last Machine, which gets a lot of updates. There's a video trailer that I just put out, which you guys are mentioned in. I don't know if you guys noticed that.
Yeah, we did. Thanks.
And you're very welcome. No, I mean, it was a great endorsement that you guys gave me, so there was no way I wasn't going to put it in there. So that one, the page on Facebook is @3BillionYears with the number 3. And I would just say that if readers come to the book and read it, whether you like it or not, I'd love your feedback, and I would love a review on Amazon. If you can give me a review on Amazon, it would be tremendous. I'm trying to get to 100 reviews, which is apparently an important number.
Thank you very much for joining us. That's going to conclude our author interview number 1 of many to come, hopefully.
I was number 1. I didn't know that. So now this is an even bigger honor for me. So thank you, Anna and Serge, for having me on the inaugural interview on Rhett Read Podcast.
Thanks for listening to another thrilling episode of Rhett Read Podcast.
If you like what you hear, give us a shout out.
If not, let us know why in the comments.
Don't forget to rate, review, comment, share, like, and subscribe.
You can follow us at Rhett Read Podcast on Twitter and Facebook.
Or send suggestions or fan mail to red.read.podcast@gmail.com.
Until next time.
Peace!